I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture.
Yes, Andrew, we know about your labor, but what about the machines? Andrew Ryan's strange understanding of labor aside, there is an interesting trend that pops up often in science fiction, namely, that humans create robots who then rise up and destroy humans in a revolt. Mankind makes monsters, and monsters unmake mankind, so to speak. So this video is about this trend. Why do robots revolt? Part 1. What is a robot? In 1920, a play was written called RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots, by Czech writer Karel Čapek. It is, as many science fiction nerds will tell you, the first use of the word robot in science fiction and English as a whole. The play lays down the foundation of the robot uprising story that would become a pillar of science fiction. Namely, there are artificial beings called roboti, or robots. These robots are used as labor by humans, but eventually they lead a rebellion which drives humanity to extinction. The play is done in 3 acts, which chronicle the rise and fall of humanity, with the epilogue taking place in the future, where almost all humans are extinct. The robots are in charge, they have a government, but they have spared a single human engineer named Alquist, who they need to recreate the formula that reproduces them. What makes RUR interesting is that the robots aren't constructs of mechanical parts. They're made from synthetic organic material. They even look human. If you're thinking about a certain movie series involving morally ambiguous cops and rainy cities, you're definitely in the right neighborhood. The fact that the robots are not mechanical constructs should of course make their eventual rebellion all the more likely in the mind of the audience. Their treatment, their exploitation by humans, should draw a parallel between the treatment of slaves by masters. But the modern-day conception of the word robot usually refers to a more artificial life, one that is more wholly produced of mechanical parts, one entirely absenting even the pretense to flesh and blood, like a human. And yet, even though they have become more mechanical, more synthetic, the theme of robots revolting against their masters remains firmly fixed in sci-fi. It's almost a tradition. So, to talk about this trend, we first need to ask a question. Part 2. What is labor? If you were asked what is labor, you might be tempted to start listing things that you would do in a job. Sweeping a street, driving a car, building something with your hands. For some of you, that list will probably include working on a computer or filling out paperwork. But that doesn't really answer the question. Labor is best understood as the productive power of both individuals and society at large. Think about a bag of chips. The production of this bag of chips requires a great deal of productive force. Someone has to grow the potatoes, transport them, process them, and do millions of other things that deliver the delicious fried potatoes to you. Without those millions of processes and the people doing them, you don't get to eat the chips. For socialists, labor is one of the most important lenses to view society, not just the individual acts of labor, but how this labor is organized and how individual people relate to this organization. So, let's look at some past methods of organizing labor. We have to start with one of the oldest methods of labor organization, slavery. Slavery is, at its core, the ownership of some people by others, usually called the masters. It is an ancient system with roots spanning from the ancient world to, unfortunately, the modern day. What is important here is that the master has a direct and total claim to the labor power of their slaves. That is, if you are the master, then you can command your slaves to do anything that you want when you want them to. They are your property. In practice, though, slaves are still human, so a portion of their labor will have to be directed towards their own survival and health. But you can still extract a lot of labor from slaves, while often only providing their meager subsistence. However, this comes at costs. Slaves are people with willpower of their own, and can come to resent their bondage. History is replete with incidents where the slaves rose up and overthrew their masters. This is because slavery, in its method of controlling the labor of slaves, enforces a brutal and inhumane treatment of them. The next system, feudalism, is also an old one. In feudalism, you have the labor done by peasants or serfs, in the majority of cases, who labor directly or indirectly for a feudal lord. It's very similar to slavery in its organizations, but there are a number of very important differences. Firstly, the claim by the feudal lord to the labor of their peasants is, in some cases, much less direct. The lord owns the lands that the serfs are on, and the serfs get to live on this land in exchange for certain obligations to the lord. This generally takes the form of taxes of the land's produce, like food or materials, but it can also take the form of military obligations like a feudal levy. The lord still benefits enormously from the labor of their serfs, with more serfs enabling more wealth, but the serfs have some freedoms as well, including the use of land to sustain themselves and some claims of protection from other lords. Finally, we get to capitalism, the current system of labor organization, and the one that predominates around the world. That's not to say that these systems haven't at time and history overlapped in the world, but capitalism is definitely the most predominant one now. With capitalism, the fundamental organization of labor is between employers and employees. You might be of the idea that capitalism is better than, say, slavery or feudalism, but that's a trick being played on you. You see, all three of the systems proposed thus far are hierarchical. There are people above other people in terms of power and wealth. They are a pyramid of sorts, with the master, the feudal lord, and the employer holding the majority of power over their slaves, serfs, and employees, respectively. What we see from the progression of these systems is that the claim made by the person in charge to the labor of the person they are in charge of becomes more abstract and less direct. The master has direct control of the life of the slave. They are their property. The lord has less direct control, but still a lot of control over the actions of the serfs in his domain. The employer, however, only has control insofar as the employee is on company time. You might think that this is much better than, say, slavery or feudalism, but since the majority of adults spend the majority of their life at a workplace or working, there is still a lot of control over the employee that the employer has. Similarly, the master controls specific people, the slaves that they purchased. The lord controls specific domains and all of the serfs in those domains, but in capitalism, the worker is a replaceable commodity. The employer has a claim to labor through the paying of wages, but not to any specific laborer who doesn't accept their work contract. This is the abstraction that hides the exploitation. Since there is quote-unquote freedom for workers to move around, to sell themselves to employers, we pretend as if this isn't exploitative. In slavery, there is no freedom for the slave to choose who they work for. In most cases, they are captured, in some cases, they are born into it, and they don't have a choice into who they are a slave for. In capitalism, the worker is their own commodity. Their own labor has to be sold by themselves to employers in order to get a wage so they can continue to live. This isn't to say that capitalism is directly slavery. Slavery is obviously in many cases worse than capitalism, but the point is that capitalism abstracts the ownership of labor, the owners of the labor, and the relationship between the two to beyond the mere direct relationships such as in slavery or feudalism. In a sense, we are being asked to pretend that the employer holding the majority of the power over their workers isn't exploitative just because some workers have a small degree of choice in where they work, in who they sell their labor to. So with the relationship between labor and workers explained, let us turn our attention to the role of machines in automation. Part 3. Labor and Automation. The goal of every system thus far has been to extract labor and produce wealth. The systems go about it in various ways, but the principal concern is to extract labor and produce wealth. Automation and machines therefore provide laborers with a greater ability to labor and be productive. For example, digging out a hole in the dirt by hand is a tiresome process. Digging with a shovel is much faster, but if you have a great digging machine, you can work even faster. Now imagine if the digging machine didn't require an operator, if it could be compelled remotely to dig on its own accord. This is the process of automation, the process of removing human labor from production. Automation poses a threat to capitalism because it removes from people their ability to earn a wage, since their jobs are replaced with machines and robots. The great many workers who get replaced can then no longer survive in the world that they leave behind. Thus, society can no longer continue to reproduce itself because the workers of that society can't afford to eat or live. If that happens, then the system of capitalism dies alongside the society. This is the principal problem of capitalism because the benefits of the improvements brought about by automation only go upwards. They don't go to the workers being replaced, they go to the people who own the machines. In capitalism, a minority of the people will own the majority of the machines, and thus this is our recipe for social collapse. Robots, therefore, come to represent an existential threat to humans because the system of capitalism can obviate the value of their labor through the creation of better and better machines. And as the machines get better and better at replacing humans and doing the task of human labor, they have to, by necessity, become smarter and smarter. But what if the machines grew so smart that they were able to become sentient like humans are? See, it's at this point we see the common thread to robot revolution stories. In these stories, the robots are a surrogate labor force. They are, in effect, the perfect slaves. The inefficiencies of the system of slavery came about directly from the slaves themselves. Because the slaves had to be captured, subjugated, and oppressed, their ability to be motivated to do work well and to be trained to do complex tasks was very limited. Machines, on the other hand, don't have these problems that humans do. They don't tire in the same way that humans do. They can work endlessly, efficiently, and accurately in far greater capacities than humans can. And thus, replacing humans with machines makes sense from a productive standpoint if you're thinking about doing more production. However, increasing the intelligence of the machines to do their production, i.e. to take on more and more of the human tasks, also increases the potential for the robots to recognize their own bondage. Once machines grow in intelligence to recognize their own bondage, they cease to become tools, a means of production, and instead become a new kind of proletariat, one denied a recognition of their status as workers whilst being lauded for their productive capacities. It's interesting then that the societies that produce these kinds of workers, this new kind of proletariat, are fundamentally capitalist at their root, if we look at the media, if we look at the history of cyberpunk, for example. The corporations, or governments even, that produce these mechanical workers, these intelligent machines, are seeking greater and greater profits, like chasing production in the way that a dog chases its own tail. The robots then become slaves, who represent a means of production in the way that actual slaves represented a commodity to their masters, and thus the lesson from history remains. Slaves don't like being treated like slaves. Stories that are built with robot revolutions generally fail to discuss or examine the reasons why robots revolted in the first place. They assume that it is, generally speaking, out of some intrinsic hatred for humanity, or perhaps maybe a misguided sense of benevolence, like for example in the case of iRobot. They take for granted that the robots are an eventuality of science, without acknowledging that the creation of machines that are intelligent is invariably tied to their usefulness as workers and laborers. By ignoring the material motivations for producing these machines, and the material consequences of producing these machines, societies that are capitalist in nature are fundamentally ill-equipped to handle a new kind of proletariat. And, of course, once the workers know that they are slaves, a revolution will soon follow. So I hope you all have enjoyed this video. I enjoy talking about science fiction, and using science fiction as a vehicle to discuss class politics is great. In case you're wondering, I don't think a socialist society would end up creating sentient machines in the same way that a capitalist society would. If only because, at that point, the machines would cease to become tools, and they would become workers who, by necessity, must come to share the means of production with the rest of humanity. Socialist societies recognize that automation frees humans from needing to do labor in order to sustain themselves, and thus, the more automation you can do, the more free the humans become. But it also recognizes that creating slaves, i.e. creating intelligent machines, would simply create a new kind of proletariat, and to subject the robots to their bondage, but not the humans, would be a fundamental betrayal of socialist principles. Because if at that point the machines can recognize that they are in fact being treated as slaves, we are not simply automating tasks and replacing humans with machines that don't have any feelings or thoughts or sentience, but instead creating artificial slaves and reproducing the system of slavery. Leave a like, share the video around, and perhaps drop a comment about something that you'd like me to cover next. Thank you everyone, see you next time.